Do you believe that in the second semester we should start seeing an acceleration of growth in Brazil?
Yes, that's our expectation. We expect the economy to, show broad signs of stabilization in the first half, and then to incrementally start to see some green shoots emerging and the economy starting to recover in the second half. On all counts, we still expect a somewhat protracted and shallow recovery.
What are the biggest challenges for investors in Brazil in 2017, considering the current political and economic scenario?
The main challenge will mostly come from the economy. We need to see further progress towards fiscal consolidation, further progress towards the consolidation of inflation towards the target, which would allow the central bank to continue to reduce the policy rate. It's going to be a bumpy road on the political side. We still have the car wash investigation in full motion, and that may generate bouts of volatility in the market, so the investor has to be nimble and adjust to that emerging reality.
Do you believe that political stability will dictate the confidence of new investments in Brazil?
Yes, I think that has been the case in the previous years. In the analysis that we've done, we found that there's a very high correlation between investor confidence and actual investments, and therefore growth. And investor confidence has been strongly influenced by political events. So that's likely to continue to be the case. The thing is that for the time being, the most important political event will continue to be Lava Jato and all the consequences of that. We think at the same time that political considerations have been more relevant, significant for local investors than foreign investors. Because if you look at FDI, foreign direct investment, the amount of foreign direct investment flowing into Brazil has been pretty much stable at about 60 billion, which is interesting in a strange way. But still, as I said, politics have been part of the economic activity through investment, and that will continue to be the case 17, 18, and more importantly as we approach the presidential elections.
Thank you. The key structural problem of Brazil is fiscal, as you said. Can you please talk about that?
Our focus is the government's rating. Therefore, fiscal is a critical component of our views and therefore of our opinion as expressed by the rating. In the case of Brazil, we've always pointed out that Brazil's fiscal indicators, particularly debt to GDP, were out of line with the rest of its peers. This was true when Brazil was investment grade. This continues to be true now, but more importantly, there's more of a gap between Brazil and the rest. In previous years, debt to GDP in Brazil was around 55%. Now it's around 70%, and we think it's going to about 90%. So what we mean when we say that the fiscal problem is structural is that it's something that is ingrained, that will be there for a while, and that it requires political measures, political decisions, structural reforms that have to go through Congress for the authorities to be able to address that. We're starting to see a structural response in terms of the approval in Congress of the spending limits. There's another element that has to do with pension reform. So they're trying to provide structural answers to the structural problems. Still, even under a best case scenario, we anticipate that debt to GDP will continue to be there and will continue to increase. So that will remain a major driver of our rating, and that is one of the reasons why we at present have a negative outlook, because we're trying to estimate how high debt to GDP will go and when it will eventually stabilize. At this time, all we know in terms of our projections is that it will continue to go up.
What are the political and economic perspectives for Brazil in the coming years?
For these next 6 months, I believe that the Brazilian economy will continue to be a functioning economy, right? So you still have Petrobras, which is a company that improved a lot from the past year and is helping to support the credit risk of the country. You have commodity prices, which increase and is going to help in terms of trade and exchange rate. And you're also going to have monetary policy. We have inflation expectations anchored, and you have decreasing rates aimed at its inflation also decreasing. So, and overall, for the next 6 months, I believe that we're still going to have this functioning economy that can support the outlook. But the question is, when are the risks of the next year election will start to arise? Because there is a big risk here that I believe the probability of we seeing an agenda on this election that will support the unwind of all the fiscal reforms that we had in last year and we're going to have throughout this first semester is actually high. So most likely by September of this year, after a semester of a positive agenda from the government with the pension reform with the Congress, I believe that we are going to start seeing more discussion towards the next year election. Will we have though a chaos or a very high volatility as we experienced between 2015 and 16? Not likely. Because again, we still have these very positive macro drivers that are working and support the country in terms of the macro outlook. But I still believe that some risk should start to be priced in on the Brazilian assets of this risk of we're seeing the unwind of most of the fiscal reforms. Because in reality, also, the fiscal reforms are a very high burden. Right, the ceiling on the fiscal expenditures is going to be very high to be attained for the next 3 to 5 years.
Do you think Temer government will be able to pass all reforms needed to put the country back on its path to growth? And will the population support the implementation of these reforms?
Yeah. No, that's a critical question. I think the short answer is that President Temer probably will not be able to deliver on all the reforms necessary to be able to have a sustainable long-term growth for the country. The fact of the matter is that Brazil is facing a structural fiscal imbalance that's not easy to unwind. There are a number of inefficiencies in the economy. So what we'll probably see is that the Temer administration will take a very important step in that direction. The first and most important of that will be the approval of pension reform, much more so than the approval of the cap on spending that occurred at the end of last year. Close to 80% of Brazil's spending is constitutionally earmarked. A good chunk of that comes from pension expenditures. So this will go a long way in tackling the issue. But unfortunately, it's probably not going to be enough. We're probably going to have to, given that Congress will dilute part of pension reform, and also you have other earmark spending provisions that need to be tackled, whoever gets elected in 2018 will have to take that baton and continue on a reformist path. And when we look at the inefficiencies of the Brazilian economy, they are tremendous. We need a regulatory overhaul in key regulated sectors of the economy. The tax system is extraordinarily inefficient. We need tax reform. We need labor reform as well. Again, the Temer administration will probably take modest steps in labor reform, but probably not much in the tax overhaul. Right? So there is a very large agenda that needs to be tackled. So then the question becomes, even though Temer may have political conditions to move on some of this over the course of 2017, what can we expect over the next 2 to 3 years, and most particularly after the 2018 presidential election? Here, I would say that one concern will be a sustained low growth environment, a new middle class that's very angry over the quality of public services, and therefore an electorate that's very angry at politicians. So you're going to have a candidate that will represent that anger and then translate that to an agenda that's still consistent with these structural impediments. Most likely we'll get some progress on that, but we have to recognize that when voters want better education, better health care, and more security, that's a demand for more spending. And that runs counter to some of the adjustments that are needed, right? So unfortunately, we probably will have a very long and painful adjustment, and we'll have to be in an environment where governments will be afraid of the opportunity cost of not reforming.